Good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the MIT Water Summit. My name is Quantum Wei.
I'm Gualtiero Jäger.
We're co-presidents of the MIT Water Club. The MIT Water Club is a student group on campus here. Our mission is to bring together people to connect and learn about water. We do this through a couple of events that we hold. The first is the Water Summit. Another event we hold in the spring is the MIT Water Innovation Prize. That's a business competition open to any student team with a water-related business idea. We connect them with people in the water sector to develop their business plans, and then they get a chance to compete for $30,000 in grant money.
So if you have an idea, please join. In spring, we also have MIT Water Night on World Water Day. That's a night where we showcase research, innovation, art, and education around water. And throughout the year, we have lectures with invited speakers. We have lunch and learns with students on campus. And we have monthly meetings that you're always welcome to join. And please sign up to our newsletter if you'd like to be in touch. All these events, of course, are possible through our sponsors. And we are extremely grateful for both for their support and their mentorship. I would like to mention JWAFs on campus. They are steadfast and really critical. We have PepsiCo, Xylem, and Watts, the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, the MIT Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. We have MIT Left Arcade support. From the MIT Management School, we have Sustainability Initiative supporting us, as well as MIT Legatum, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and the Harvard MIT COOP. Sincere thank you. And with that, we'd like to turn it over to our summit director, Ivana. She has done a fantastic job, as well as an entire student team in organizing this. It takes long hours, and we're extremely proud of them. So, round of applause, please.
Morning, everyone. Welcome to the summit again. And just a quick thank you to the audience, our speakers and sponsors, and everyone else who made this event possible. As Gualtiero said, it's taken long hours and hard work, so I definitely want to thank Gualtiero and Quantum and the summit team especially for making this event possible. So this year's theme is the Water Food Nexus. So we'll be focusing on the most pressing issues in the water sector in this regard. So we'll reflect on the role of water in food production and the innovation, technologies, policies, et cetera, that enable us to have healthy and sustainable communities. So we're very excited to have a very diverse lineup this year. So we have members from academia, NGOs, conservation organizations, government, and people from industry as well. So the goal of the summit is really to foster a dialogue between these different members with different perspectives on the variety of topics. So the theme of the first day is watering our crops, which is today. So we'll be focusing on water use in agriculture. We'll have two keynote speakers to kick it off. We'll have Professor Chandra Madramootoo and Rajiv Singh. And we'll then have three panels throughout the day. We'll have a panel on groundwater resources, on surface water pollution, and on our uncertain water future in the face of climate change and population growth. And we'll also have a couple networking sessions throughout the day. You can see the agenda here. And at the end of the day, we'll have a poster reception and tech showcase, and that'll just give students and a couple companies the opportunity to showcase their work that's related to the Water Food Nexus. And tomorrow, the topic is growing our protein. So we'll be looking at livestock production and seafood production, and looking at the water footprint of livestock production, the ecological impact of seafood production, and looking at sustainable practices in both of those moving forward. So we'll have one keynote speaker tomorrow morning, Christopher Briggs from the Water Footprint Network, and then we'll also have three panels. So we'll have a panel on livestock production, on seafood production, and then we'll have a closing panel that's just gonna reflect on the previous panels and kind of try to tie everything together and talk about steps that we can take moving forward to meet the increasing food demand. And with that, I will introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Chandra Madramootoo, who's a visiting professor at MIT and a visiting scholar at JWAFs. He'll be introducing the Water Food Nexus to us. So a round of applause.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Ivana, Gualtero, and also Quantum and the organizers of this Water Summit. It's been a pleasure to work with you over the past few weeks to develop this, so thank you. What I'd like to do this morning is set the stage for some of the debates and challenges that we face in food production and water as we think about food security and also some of the challenges going forward in trying to make irrigation, particularly focus on irrigation and smallholder irrigation, which is critical to food security, much more sustainable than it currently is. And obviously, for the sake of time, I wouldn't be able to cover the whole spectrum of water and food security, but just some of the areas that I think that are important and areas that which I work in. Now, if we think that there are about 1,500 million hectares or so of global cropland, roughly 20% of that, or 300 million hectares, are irrigated. And that 20% of global cropland, irrigated cropland, produces 40% of the world's food. So irrigation is particularly important to food security. Irrigation has helped us to deal with water variability and also water scarcity. It's helped us to be able to get 2 to 3 crops a year, moving away from rain-fed production, which is just 1 crop a year, to get 2 or more crops per year, particularly in Southeast Asia. That doesn't say that we neglect the other 1,200 million hectares of rain-fed lands. Of course, that is important, and all of that rain-fed area will never become irrigated, even with spate irrigation and other rudimentary forms of surface irrigation will not be completely irrigated, but there's obviously much more that could be done with respect to improved water management on those rain-fed areas. And one of the points I want to make this morning is that what we normally do sometimes is compartmentalize irrigated agriculture with rain-fed agriculture. But there's actually a gray zone between the two. And there are several rain-fed farmers in many parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, and also Asia and Latin America, who do practice some form of water harvesting and water management to be able to get more than 1 crop a year. They might not be able to get 2 full crops, but they can get a partial second crop. So it is very much a gray zone between those 2 categories of water management and agriculture. Now, very quickly, just to point out that most of this irrigated area, as you can see, about over 70%, is in Asia. And you'll see there it's broken up into about 80 million hectares that is irrigated by groundwater, and about over 130 million hectares that comes from surface schemes, tank irrigation schemes, canal networks, and so on. And one point to bear in mind, and I know that there's a panel later on this morning, is that the area that is covered by groundwater irrigation is rapidly rising. And one of the phenomena that we see is that as surface water schemes, canal and tank irrigation schemes become unreliable in terms of scarcity, climate change, maintenance of the irrigation network, farmers are no longer relying exclusively on the established irrigation networks, but are putting in their own tube wells to augment the amount of water that they have for irrigation. And that is putting enormous pressures on the groundwater resource. We only have to look here, for example, in the United States. We look at the High Plains Aquifer in the US. We look at the Indo-Gangetic Plains in north of India. We look at the North China Plains, immense pressures on groundwater and the availability of groundwater to sustain agriculture. But no doubt that irrigation, extraordinary large acreages of irrigation in Asia has what has helped to fuel the Green Revolution. And as you can see here, cereal yields, primarily the three major cereals of rice, wheat, and maize, have expanded considerably over the period since the start of the Green Revolution in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And unfortunately, one of the factors here is that of the major areas of producing cereals, sub-Saharan Africa remains relatively low. And this is despite some of the recent innovations around drought-tolerant maize and also stress-tolerant rice, that's being produced by Africa, and also Africa rice and Erie. We still see these very low levels of yield improvement and expanded areas under rice, wheat, and maize in sub-Saharan Africa. But apart from the crop technology, water is obviously a very critical factor here as well. Now, you've seen these statistics, I think, globally, that irrigation withdrawals are approximately 70% of the fresh water that's used in most countries. But I think one important point to bear in mind is that this number varies by region. And as you can see here in South Asia and in the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, it's much larger than the global average of 70%. Particularly when we look at South Asia and Southeast Asia, over 80%, sometimes over 90% of the water that's withdrawn goes into irrigated agriculture and livestock as well. Unfortunately, in the Middle East and North Africa particularly, and sub-Saharan Africa, although those amounts are quite high, those are very water-stressed areas of the world. So if we look at the ratio of water withdrawn to total water available, there is continuing to be a decline in that ratio as a result of the fact that there's less water available for withdrawal in those areas. Now, where does that water for irrigation go? And as you can see here, particularly on the chart at the right here, you can see most of it is going into rice. Close to 30% of that water withdrawal, particularly in South Asia and Southeast Asia, goes into irrigated paddy production. And you can see wheat and maize follow, wheat being 18% and maize being 13%. Interestingly enough, crops that are much more drought tolerant, such as millet and sorghum, while they do use some amounts of water and they are much better adapted to water stress, their amounts of irrigation are very low. So there is a case to be made for the expansion of some of these minor crops, such as millets, sorghum, barley, and also some of the pulses and lentil crops particularly, which also have biological nitrogen fixation value as well to the soil root environment. And so the question for us today, both from a crop genetics standpoint and an irrigation engineering standpoint, is what could be done to optimize the use of water in maize, rice, and wheat production systems, particularly when we look at the fact that most of those crops are grown by smallholders around the world. Now, the most recent estimate by the FAO says that we would need approximately 60% increase in food production to be able to meet the demands for food by the year 2050. And as you can see, in terms of, again, at the right of this chart, if we look at the cereals, that's where some of the largest increases in food demands will be in the future. You'll also see very steep increases in meat. But the question is, with water scarcity, water stress, dwindling fresh water supplies, and also scarcity of arable land, how much more can we expand the land and water resource base to be able to achieve that need for food? And the reality is there's very little that could be done in terms of fresh water availability and also land resources to be able to achieve some of that need. And more, we're going to have to think about how we improve the irrigation water programs, how we improve our crop management programs as well with better agronomics to be able to achieve those kinds of increases. Now, very quickly, to put this into some perspective with respect to the calories that are consumed, you'll notice here that also those cereal crops, the projections for their consumption increasing by the year 2050 with data from the FAO. And right now, we're somewhere in this area here. And if we look at how we put this in terms of a forecast, in terms of kilocalories, one of the other problems that is very seldom discussed is the whole issue around nutrition. And if you consider that we probably only need about 22 to 2,300 kilocalories per person per day, then the question also with respect to some of the impacts, health impacts that we're seeing around obesity, heart disease and stroke and some of these chronic non-communicable diseases, the question is also how do we intervene with respect to diets to be able to deal with some of these demands for food. So it is quite a multifaceted problem in trying to achieve a solution in which we as consumers or people who are purchasing these food products need to also think a bit more clearly where our role is in that problem. So recent work that's been put out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in their recent assessment report, of course, shows that the average decline in yields for some of the major crops across Africa and South Asia is probably going to decline by approximately 18%, and it will also have an impact on fisheries. And also the problems that are going to be caused by heat stress as a result of climate change. And the fact that if we continue along our current path of production of or emissions that are produced from our usage of fossil fuels, then this rise in temperature of 4 degrees C is going to have a major impact on the types of crops that we currently grow, which are C3 and C4 crops that aren't able to withstand that kind of increase of temperature that is being projected. So this is also something that we have to take into consideration, and that's why there's also several large breeding programs that are going on in the CGIAR and also in the private sector with respect to development of genetic pathways in crops that can deal with these kinds of heat stresses in the future. Now, very quickly, because this is not really a discussion on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions per se, but I just wanted to point out some of the factors that we have to consider when we think about agronomic management and agronomic practices going forward. And particularly in the developing countries, some of the largest, first of all, that there is quite an increase in the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. So although agriculture is not the largest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere, if one considers the transportation sector, the industrial sector, and so on. The fact is that greenhouse gas emissions are going up quite sharply in the developing world, and the reverse is happening in an almost stable in the developed world. But there are two major greenhouse gases that are causing these rises in emissions that we see here. First of all, nitrous oxide emissions that are coming from fertilizer and also some from manure, but also methane emissions from manure, the burning of animal dung, and also methane from rice production systems. And the point about reducing water usage in rice is also the fact that you could help to minimize the amount of methane that is being produced in those systems. So that's another factor that we are going to have to take into account as we consider agricultural or agronomic management practices and water management practices going forward, is the balance here with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. Now, work that's been done by the World Resources Institute show where we're going to have some of the impacts. And as you can see here, most parts of the world are colored here in red in terms of a decline in crop yield as we move towards a warmer world. And some of the areas that are extremely water stressed, Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, large parts of the Middle East, and also India, China, and South Asia, we're going to see declines in crop yields as we continue to experience rises in temperature. So that's the other call to be able to address some of the emissions of greenhouse gases that would help to protect some of the crop yields that we need to have going forward to meet these food demands. Now, in other work that's been done by the World Resources Institute, and they have a very nice website, the Aqueduct website. If you go on that website, you can find every single crop that's grown and what the impact of water stress will be on those crops going forward. And you'll see country by country on that map, the areas that are colored from green to orange to yellow. And here, overall, you'll notice that in terms of water stress, which is represented here in high-risk areas, 40% or more of the available water supply withdrawn is in excess of the water available, going up to as high as 80%. You'll see here that irrigated cropland, the areas of irrigated cropland that's going to suffer from water stress going forward, it's about 56% of the current irrigated areas that are going to be affected by water stress. And for all cropland, it's going to be about 28% as a result of water scarcity. Cotton being some of the highest areas affected by water stress, 57%. And then you'll see wheat, maize, and also rice in here. As I said, the map shows very nicely where are the areas in the world where this is going to happen. So again, the call for us to be able to better manage water as a result of those water stresses. Now, one of the examples that I like to use in terms of where we can go forward is with respect to the Indus Basin of Pakistan and parts of India. It is the basin that lends itself to the best measurements, has some of the best data with respect to water use and water efficiency. And it has been measured very extensively over the past 30 or 40 years because there are very good controls of water coming in from the 5 large dams that supply water into the Indus Basin. It's the largest contiguous irrigated basin in the world, about 20 million hectares of irrigated land. And also, we know pretty much what's coming out at the various distributaries through measurements that have been done. And there's been a lot of modeling work that has been done as well to be able to extend these measurements. And if you take all of the data that has been collected over several years, roughly about 60%, 66%, 64 to 66% of the water that is withdrawn is actually not going into crop production. Now, to put this into context, of course, there has to be water that goes to maintain environmental flows, in-stream flows, and so on, and to provide water for ecological habitats. So there's no way that one would ever expect this to close the circle in terms of 100%. But certainly on a basin scale, and the largest irrigated basin in the world, contiguous irrigated basin in the world, there is a lot of room for improvement as one looks at this number of overall irrigation efficiency. And the question is, what could be done to bring us up more towards an efficiency of around 60 to 70% in the overall basin, considering the variability in soils, levels of salinization and waterlogging in that basin, and also the fact that in many of these areas, the irrigation water not only provides in-stream flows, ecological flows, but is also being used for human consumption as well. It's not moving that easily. Okay. In terms of engineering, we also have some other challenges in trying to get to this improve irrigation efficiencies. And unfortunately, not all of it is technological. Some of it, a major part of it, is also institutional. Around the engineering part of it, it's how water is delivered to cropland. In many areas, particularly in developing world, water is made available on a rotational basis, what we call the water duty. And so every 5 to 7 days, water is available from the canal delivery structures at the field to be able to supply a farmer with water. Because farmers are uncertain when next they are going to get water and how much is available, there's this tendency to break away from the rotational scheme, and as a result of inadequate surface water deliveries, to themselves block off water in the canals and prevent other farmers downstream from accessing water. So this whole aspect of being able to access water on an equitable basis because of the engineering around the rotational water delivery schedule poses a major challenge for us as we try to rebuild these irrigation schemes. Not to mention very poorly maintained infrastructure, and despite the fact that much work has been done institutionally on the creation of water users associations and also cost recovery by the farmers themselves, this has not really taken off to the point that it has been able to prevent this tail-ender problem and improper distribution of water. So there's also work to be done on the institutional side to be able to address water deliveries in the future. Now here's a map that was produced by the World Bank a year or two ago. It's entitled, quite appropriately, High and Dry. And what this map shows is that if we continued with our water management technologies and practices as we know them today, these are the areas that are very much going to be affected today in terms of GDP. So this is a map of GDP, and you see the areas here where current water management programs and policies have a very negative impact on GDP. And if it continues to happen in what we call the business as usual scenario going forward, these areas will continue to get worse. And so here, if we were to start to implement improved practices and policies and technologies, there's probably some hope in that some of these red areas will change to light blue and dark blue, and we could actually see some improvements in GDP going forward, although parts of North Africa and the Middle East, the MENA region, will still be very much susceptible to water stress. So obviously a call here that if we didn't do anything with respect to water management, improved technologies, practices, and institutional systems, we could see very serious declines in GDP in major parts of the world, particularly in India and China. So here's another parameter to put into the equation, and I kind of alluded to it at the start of the talk, and that is how land is distributed and who is actually farming the land. And two key statistics I wanted to point out here is where smallholders fit into the system. And as you can see here, that 92% of all farms are small farms, less than 2 hectares or less. So large numbers of small farms, and you can see here the number of small farmers. The number of people who are farming 2 hectares or less, over 500 million, 500 million small farmers in the world. So we have two situations here that we need to put into the equation, because these are the small irrigators. These are much of the irrigation that we've been talking about is conducted by these people. And in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, about 80% of the food that is supplied in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa comes from smallholders. And so we have to think now, as we look at technologies and management practices and systems, that these large numbers of small farmers are not insignificant to trying to achieve global food security. And I don't see Mark Rosegrant in the room, but the people at IFPRI like to talk about this triangle, this pyramid, and the fact that those 560 million smallholders are in this pyramid, and there's a lot of emphasis on how to segregate that pyramid. And generally, work that's being done by IFPRI, and Mark may talk more about this in his presentation, is that we look at the number of farmers, the largest number of farmers, smallholders, are down at the bottom of the pyramid. And these are people who don't own the land, they're asset poor, they make less than $1 a day. They also don't have access to sufficient water. And the question is then, should we be paying attention to these farmers down here? Perhaps many of them want to actually come out of agriculture. And if governments were to have a policy to buy those farmers out, then the agricultural production system, smallholder agricultural production system, might be much more efficient. And so one of the questions that's being asked as we address improved irrigation technologies, should we not look at these categories of farmers in here, in this top of the pyramid and roughly in the middle of the pyramid here? And certainly the ones at the top of the pyramid, something in the order of 50 to 75 million smallholders, do have the financial resources and are currently able to access particularly agronomic technology. So with a little bit of a push and a stimulus, they might be able to adopt very rapidly, very easily, at their own cost, improved irrigation technologies. And those in the middle here, which are probably the bulk of that 300 million, something in the order of 200 or 250 million, then maybe they need some sort of intervention to be able to help them to achieve better water management. So that's very much a parameter that's looming out there in this whole equation of water and food security that can't be neglected. And so from the institutional standpoint, what is it that we need to do here as well? Okay, thank you. So I'm going to quickly skip through this since I've only got 2 minutes. But, you know, certainly projections by the FAO, increasing crop yields, of course, playing a major role here. But is that really possible going forward? Oops, something going on here. Not sure why this. So a paper by Wada et al. In Nature Geosciences a couple of years ago said that for us to achieve, they gave 6 pathways or 6 wedges towards improved water management in the world, not just for agriculture, but in general. One was to increase irrigation efficiency by the year 2050 by 40%, and to increase agricultural productivity by 20% by 2050. Based on that previous chart I showed you, the question is that possible? But the point I want to make here is that there is no simple pathway. Improvements in technologies, institutions, governance, and policies are required. But one message I want to leave you with, again, coming back to these smallholder farmers in the middle and the top of the pyramid, is I believe water use efficiency and water management relies very much on having better markets. And I think that there's much more that needs to be done on the integration between markets and also improved water management for smallholders. Well, I'm going to skip some of these slides here for the sake of time, since I've only got a few minutes. Not sure. But some of the things that could be done in variable rate irrigation technology, precision irrigation management, to be able to better achieve food security. And being able to map, one of my graduate students trying to map much better with unmanned aerial vehicles, the crop canopy to look at heat stress and water stress using some new camera technology, I think. Innovations in groundwater management, but I know Dennis and his group will talk about that. But coming back to the question of markets, here's what we currently have. Very poorly structured markets from smallholder irrigation schemes. The other problem that we see is large gluts. For some reason, smallholder irrigators, one of the first crops they love to grow is tomatoes. And they look at the price of tomatoes on the market and they start to grow lots of tomatoes. Then they try to sell those tomatoes, and because everybody else is growing tomatoes, they can't get those sold. And so I think these are some of the reasons why we see such poor water management, because they just don't get the economic returns to be able to manage water better. I don't know what's going on. Oops, gone all the way to your talk, Rajiv. But I think for the sake of time, since I have to get off here, yeah, should I just use this? So let me just close on a couple of things, how we add value to irrigated agriculture by bringing in new types of structured markets. And if we can link the input and output to irrigated agriculture through digital technologies and trying to use digital technologies throughout the chain to be able to access credit, mobile banking schemes, and so on, get better access to fertilizer and seeds. You tie that into your product, and sometimes it is an integrated system between the suppliers and the buyers. I think that is going to grossly improve water management. And so certainly something I've just written up about in the Journal of Irrigation and Drainage is this whole new business model around irrigation and what we have to do throughout the chain, including capacity building and training, to be able to improve the value chain. So I'm going to stop there. And on that note, let me also say one of the areas that, particularly if they're anthropologists and sociologists in the room, one factor that requires much, much more attention is the area of feminization of women in agriculture. And feminization in agriculture is certainly something that we have to contend with. That number is growing, the number of women smallholders, and how we improve technology, get them to access credit, finance, markets, and input supplies is something that we have to think much more about going forward. So thank you very much.